Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar, Clean Hydrogen's Place in the Energy Transition. We have a wonderful session with you today, and we have a couple of amazing panelists. We are going to make this session as communicative as possible. There's all going to be a lot of debates from the panel members. But first and foremost, just to let you all know that at Carbon Tracker, we released our hydrogen reports fall of this year, titled Clean Hydrogen's Place in the Energy Transition. The goal of this webinar is to highlight some of the main or the key findings of the reports. And if you haven't read the reports, please go to our website to get a copy of the reports. The structure of this session, I'm going to give a 5 to 10 minute presentation, just highlighting some of the key points of the report. And then I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to discuss the key findings of the reports. And we're just going to have a nice dialogue about the industry as a whole. And then we'll then open up the channel, the Q&A channel, to the rest of the attendees. And please, if you have any questions to ask, there is no such thing as a dumb question, as everybody says. Please feel free to write that down on the Q&A over the Zoom Q&A slots, and I'll try my best to ask every question asked today. So we're just going to go straight to it. Like I said, so the title of our report is Clean Hydrogen's Place in the Energy Transition. You know, the good thing about the hydrogen industry, or this hydrogen phase, is that, you know, if we date back, you know, pre-war levels, you know, the question on hydrogen was probably being flagged by almost every major developed nation as basically that key clean energy fuel to help decarbonize almost every sector of the economy. But obviously, I mean, those plans actually hit a major wrench once, obviously, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. This caused, you know, a major disruption in the gas price market. And obviously, the initial ambition for Europe and for the US to scale up hydrogen, particularly fossil hydrogen, this is blue and gray, obviously hits a major wrench, as you know, the unit cost of these assets and the levelized cost of these assets actually skyrocketed and leapfrogged that of what we call low carbon hydrogen or green hydrogen. So in essence, what we actually found after the invasion of Ukraine, and obviously the gas prices being completely distorted, the cost of the levelized cost for hydrogen in Europe and Asia for fossil hydrogen leapfrog that of green hydrogen. Probably, you know, some say more than 70%. I know some figures also say more than 100%. But what we did, we got our data from Weiss Energy, and you know, the unit cost of the levelized cost for fossil hydrogen in Europe ranges anywhere from probably, you know, $6.2 per kilogram to just over $7 per kilogram. And obviously we see a very similar trend in Asia. For the US market is actually slightly different, because the cost of natural gas is relatively very cheap. Although there was a relative spike in the gas price market in the US, the cost for fossil hydrogen did not actually leapfrog that of low carbon green hydrogen in the United States. And you know, just a couple of months ago, the United States introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA tax scheme, which basically introduces a $3 per kilogram subsidy price on all new green hydrogen developments or green hydrogen assets. So what this means basically is that new build green hydrogen in the United States can now possibly fall under $2 per kilogram, which obviously opens a major opportunity for the US because this means that the production of green hydrogen in the US with this scheme is potentially going to make this asset one of the cheapest energy generating assets globally. And like I initially said before, this is just a data illustration on the initial commitments or the global commitment for hydrogen on a regional scale. We can see this is more, pre-war commitments, and we can see in Europe, for example, that there was a stronger commitment to scale up blue hydrogen, and obviously in North America, there's also a stronger commitment to scale up blue hydrogen. This obviously before the price actually skyrocketed. So obviously this is going to be a major concern for countries within this region, simply because the cost for scaling up of blue or gray hydrogen is now, financially unviable. And obviously with the IEA and the IPCC gas demand forecast between now and 2050, the demand for gas is obviously projected to actually fall over time. And because obviously natural gas is the main feedstock used to produce fossil hydrogen, we don't actually see these assets being viable in the mid to long-term future. So what we actually believe right here at Carbon Tracker is that these assets, fossil hydrogen assets, they will for sure become stranded, particularly those directly exposed to Russia gas. This is those assets located right here in Europe. Obviously, the cost for fossil hydrogen has skyrocketed, so it's going to be very difficult for asset owners to actually make a reasonable return. So we actually expect these assets within the medium to long term to become stranded. And in terms of the projected production for green hydrogen production, we actually see that there's going to be more of green hydrogen produced in the global south, simply because green hydrogen, as we all know, this is leverage from renewable energy technology, so solar and wind, and because these the global south countries in the global south, they have a very favorable climate environment to leverage on obviously high wind speed and very high solar irradiance, so they can actually produce more volumes of green hydrogen. We also see what we've seen since the start of the war is a very large investment commitment from predominantly the global north countries in Europe and obviously North America. They have increased their commitments to invest in more green hydrogen, and most of these investments, as we can see, actually going to be built in the global south. And the key message for our report is, the hydrogen industry before the war actually started, it was basically poised to scale up almost every single sector. So light transport, aviation, steel manufacturing, shipping, heavy transport, and so on and so forth. But we actually see this as a very unsustainable way of actually scaling up the industry, because this is a novel industry. It does have its own unique set of challenges and difficulties to actually scale up. So what we're actually suggesting from our report is that scale up should actually focus on what we call the priority sectors, or what we call the hard to abate sectors. So fertilizer industry and the heavy industry, these are what we call the hard to abate sector, because they don't have any reasonable plan B for decarbonization, whereas for light transport, you have plan B. These are electric vehicles. For power generation, its plan for decarbonization is going to be dominated by renewable energy, solar, and wind. So in order to actually effectively and sustainably scale up the green hydrogen market, we basically say that the focus should be put more on the heavy industries, so steel, manufacturing, shipping, and obviously heavy transports. And obviously there should also be an emphasis to focus on power storage intermittencies, simply because if you do decarbonize the power generation sector, which is going to be from wind and solar, the major question is, okay, what happens when there is no sun or there's no wind actually blowing? How are we going to provide intermittent power? And we actually see hydrogen playing a major role in the medium term, obviously, until the cost of solar battery systems become reasonably cheap and affordable. So we also see hydrogen playing a role in the medium term in obviously providing power storage intermittencies. And yeah, like I said, I do want to keep this presentation relatively short because I want to introduce our panelists today. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists. We have Professor Adam Hawks from Imperial College London, Tessa Weiss from RMI, we have Lily Burge from Climate Bonds, and obviously we have Jamie Frew from a reputable consultancy right here in London. So I'm just going to open up questions from our panelists, and then I'm going to ask questions of myself.
Thanks for that presentation, Kofi. If you could elaborate on the benefits that green hydrogen development could have to economies of countries in the global south.
So can I repeat your question, Tessa?
Could you elaborate on the benefits that green hydrogen development could have to economies of countries in the global south?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the global south, I think green hydrogen presents a remarkable opportunity to basically introduce a brand new energy sector for the global south. This is an amazing opportunity for the global south to actually leverage on new revenue from green hydrogen. And in terms of the global south, the climate conditions in the global south, so we're talking Africa, we're talking Latin America, they are very, very favorable for solar development and obviously for wind in some cases. So we believe that the global south could possibly produce larger volumes of green hydrogen, but most of this hydrogen production we see is actually going to be for the export market. So it's going to be exported back to the global north for consumption and usage.
Hi, Kofi. Can I ask a question? You've got that ranking of uses of hydrogen. I often see people putting use of hydrogen in power generation fairly low on the scale, and I take a different view. I see that for every unit of hydrogen, if you've got stored hydrogen, you're firming up renewables. So actually it allows you to install more renewables if you've got something to soak up the intermittency there. So I don't see these as kind of competing. I see these as being as complementary. Is that the same way you see it, or?
I mean, not quite. I mean, with renewables, obviously the costs are going lower and lower, which is great. But the issue with renewables is basically the cost of batteries. Although they are reducing for sure, we actually project that the cost of battery will probably become affordable and competitive by the mid-2030s. So we have a good 10 years for the cost of solar battery or probably wind battery system to actually become reasonably competitive. So until then, the question is, what can actually bridge that gap? And we actually see hydrogen as a possible, obviously, clean fuel to actually bridge that gap to provide or to support baseload power.
Yeah. And do you see batteries getting so cheap that they're my understanding of batteries is that generally for up to about 8 hours, batteries win, and then after that, other technologies become more competitive. So you see batteries coming down for really long-term storage. Is that what you see?
Oh yeah, the cost of battery, they are dropping at a very, very alarming rate, and obviously within the next decade, we expect batteries to be relatively cheap. I mean, you need to keep in mind with the influx of renewable energy and the competitive nature of electric vehicles, the more the industry scales up, the more the price actually drops. So within the next 10 years, the cost of battery system would relatively be cheap and will be competitive.
If I can follow up on that question from Jamie, I think maybe there is a role for hydrogen for very long-term storage, as in seasonal storage, which is difficult for batteries gap for batteries to fill. So take, for example, building on Tessa's question about the global south, there's a number of countries we work with that are heavily based on hydropower, but it's a very seasonal hydropower. So you get these gaps of 5 or 6 months in a year where really you would benefit from some very long-term, very high volume storage. I wonder about the role of hydrogen in that space. Do you have any view on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very similar to my initial points. Obviously, we say in the short to medium term, hydrogen can bridge that intermittency gap. But once battery becomes relatively cheap and competitive, there will be no reason to actually use hydrogen to bridge that gap, because you can just use our battery systems instead.
Yeah, I wonder, one of the things about hydrogen, and I think it's one of the claims of the hydrogen advocates, is, the Swiss Army knife approach. And if you have uses of hydrogen at the top of your pyramid, such as steel and fertilizer, can you still use that same infrastructure that you're going to build to supply these industries to fill gaps in seasonal renewables?
Can you use the same infrastructure used to build to, I don't really understand.
So if you have hydrogen storage that
Okay.
you built to run your ammonia plant
Okay.
throughout the year, can that same hydrogen storage provide power at certain times of year? I believe that it's not, you can have one infrastructure that serves many purposes, and that can have a very cheap price, whereas batteries only serve one purpose. They provide
for the hydrogen storage infrastructure, you have to connect it, obviously, to generate power. You have to connect it to hydrogen power plants. Existing CCGT plants can be retrofitted to actually run on hydrogen. So as long as you have the storage facility, you can channel that to different technology or different assets for its relative purpose. So you can connect it to a power generating asset to provide power. Also, you can connect it to an ammonia plant to produce ammonia for the fertilizer industry, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And to expand on that, Jamie, I definitely see that that's a dynamic that's starting to emerge as we think about building out broadly interconnected hydrogen or industrial hubs as a way to start to build out this infrastructure, especially hydrogen salt cavern storage. You see this ability of nearly cost falling as these systems grow and scale. And so there is this opportunity to be able to use that shared infrastructure and provide security of supply to not just industrial applications that really require that consistency, but also think about how can we start to stabilize and provide ancillary benefits to the grid, as there is, as you mentioned, that very much interconnected and complementary benefit that we see from hydrogen and the electric grid.
Yeah. And obviously, Tessa, I do have a question for you, because I know you do represent the US market. Obviously, with the introduction of this new remarkable subsidy scheme, the IRA scheme, that basically knocks out $3 per kilogram from the current price of new hydrogen in the States. Obviously, I mean, we find this to be a remarkable opportunity, because what this means is that it can open up a nice exports channel for other countries around the world to basically purchase hydrogen or green hydrogen directly from the US. Question is, how could this subsidy impact the EU's goals for hydrogen adoption?
I think so. Now, low cost of hydrogen produced in the US with the $3 per kilogram subsidy for the least emissions intensive hydrogen production, it really presents a winning and very tangible opportunity for the EU to start to meet its very ambitious 20 million metric tons of renewably produced hydrogen by 2030. I think what outlooks are saying is given that scale of hydrogen that's required come 2030 in the EU, there's both a need for domestically produced hydrogen within the EU and imports. This recent study from Nature that I was reading was projecting that only 40% of that demand can be met by domestic production, given various land use, supply chain considerations, and just looking at the project pipeline that we're seeing. And so there is going to be this need for imports to start to bridge this gap and to start to keep industrial sites operational and not curtailed while we're transitioning away from gas. And so with the US subsidies found in the Inflation Reduction Act, we can land a price of hydrogen to the EU at well under $2 per kilogram. And so that's considering any costs associated with conversions and transport to get hydrogen from the US to the EU. And that is roughly, from RMI's analysis, roughly 4 times cheaper than hydrogen that could be produced either domestically in the EU or from the average cost of another importer. So there really is this opportunity to access low cost and high quantities of low carbon hydrogen coming from the US. And there's also this dynamic given that a lot of the supply chains in the EU are relatively more mature than many other hydrogen supply chains internationally. We could see this dynamic of European manufacturers and producers choosing to develop and build hydrogen projects in the US and perhaps exporting that hydrogen back to the EU. And broadly, we're seeing that this big, nearly say, source of demand for hydrogen in the EU, it's motivating other countries to start to implement similar tax credit and subsidy schemes that the US has recently implemented. And it's really created this race to the top of which country is going to be able to access and to provide that scale of exports to the EU.
Yeah,
given the EU is providing that certainty of demand.
So in essence, this can basically be a sad story for EU hydrogen, the scale up of hydrogen within the EU, because if the landing cost actually sets for hydrogen coming from the US, it's still going to be lower than $2 per kilogram, which is still higher than the average LCOH for green hydrogen in the EU. So, would you basically encourage EU policymakers to probably try and adopt a similar scheme so they can make new hydrogen within the EU as competitive in terms of cost as it is in the United States to protect the market right here?
Yeah, I definitely think subsidies for near-term subsidies for hydrogen, especially as gas prices will start to stabilize, are effective. I think there's also my colleague Natalie Janzau has published a really good article describing the need for subsidizing hydrogen in the EU, despite now there is that price discrepancy of the high cost of natural gas is even making domestically produced hydrogen cheaper. So I won't try to reiterate her thinking as that is not my area of expertise. But broadly, there's still, even though the hydrogen from the US can be orders of magnitude cheaper from, say, domestically produced hydrogen in the EU without subsidy, there's still, as I mentioned earlier, this need for both domestically produced and imported hydrogen. And there is nearly this logistical barrier of you still need to get the hydrogen from the US to the EU. And there is that barrier of you need to build out portside infrastructure, conversion infrastructure, transportation infrastructure to do so. And that is time intensive, that is logistically challenging. And so I think it's going to be both. And I don't just think that because, say, that the subsidies are so supportive in the US that it's going to completely eliminate any domestic production in the EU.
Okay, thank you so much, Tessa. I have a question for Lily Burge from Climate Bonds. So I was lucky enough to attend the COP27 conference at Sharm el-Sheikh, and I think most of the outcome of the event of the conference basically define low carbon hydrogen to include both green assets and also blue assets, which indirectly obviously encourages the production of natural gas. What is Climate Bond's take on this definition?
So I think the use of low carbon hydrogen is what we call it, low carbon hydrogen. And I think what's important is to get kind of beyond the names and to look at emissions thresholds. So we have low carbon hydrogen, we're aligned with the EU definition, and that's just if you produce hydrogen, less than 3 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of hydrogen. And that's the threshold which declines down to 0 kilos by 2050. And I think that's just really important because, so theoretically, blue hydrogen could meet this threshold, but that would require really strict CCS and leak detection and reduction along the fossil gas supply chain used to supply this blue hydrogen. And given high gas prices, we don't expect that to increase demand to increase investments in blue hydrogen infrastructure. But I think it does leave room for transitioning of grey hydrogen infrastructure and retrofitting it to blue to sort of result in immediate emission reductions. But also crucially, it means that green hydrogen will be compatible with 1.5, because there is, I think, a big risk that if we just use the definition green hydrogen, we allow green hydrogen produced from electricity. And we've seen this in the EU, that they are looking at their definitions of green hydrogen, and they've recently dropped this additionality requirement, which means that your green hydrogen has to be tied to dedicated renewable energy infrastructure, production rather. And I think that's a big concern, because if you're just producing green hydrogen straight from the grid, it could be very, very carbon intensive, if you've got a mostly coal powered grid. So I think we need to use these, kind of come back to this emissions threshold. And then we'll also speaking the same language, we use this emissions threshold, we try and, as Climate Bonds, we're helping develop other taxonomies around the world. So if we try and get this clear emissions threshold globally, then we'll have global green hydrogen production from dedicated renewable energy and renewable electricity. And I think, that's why I think calling it low carbon is important.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Lee. And just to piggyback on your point, I want to ask Professor Adam Hawk from Imperial College a follow-up question. So obviously, before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there was a very, very strong commitment from the UK to scale up hydrogen, whereby blue hydrogen was going to be dominant. And now, obviously, with the disruption of the gas price markets, what sort of advice would you give to UK government moving forward?
Thanks, Kofi. It's a good question because it is a hard one to answer. So obviously the observation is correct. Gas price increases several multiples, and there's a knock-on impact there, which is undeniable. Blue hydrogen would of course be similarly affected. And also good to note that at least a couple of years ago, so in 2021, had you looked at the pipeline of hydrogen projects in the UK, say from the IEA's hydrogen project track, you see that basically they're all blue hydrogen, and some very large ones there as well. So obviously a concern there, and it's given the current gas price, it's hard to imagine final investment decision on those projects where the operator or the owner is exposed to the competitive global price of gas, which may not always be the case, depending on the source of the resource going into the project. So fair to say the situation has changed. And I think the observation in your report that this has made green hydrogen a lot more interesting is obviously correct, noting the volatility of the price of natural gas. But I would still advise industry and government to keep options open, to appreciate the nuances and try to avoid uninformed and polarized debate on the topic. So there might still be a role for blue hydrogen. This technology is developing. There are potential, new developments out there. Alongside, of course, we don't really know what's going to happen with the price of gas over the next 5 years. So there's various projections out there and a lot of uncertainty, of course, but we will need to wait and see. It would be unwise to jump to any conclusion right now.
Okay, thanks so much, Professor Adam. And like Lily actually stated, they class low carbon hydrogen to include blue and green. So if a crazy scenario happens, the price of gas normalizes to pre-war levels or pre-COVID levels, and the LCOH for blue hydrogen basically goes back to anywhere ranging from $3 to probably $4 per kilogram. And let's just assume it's very, very hard to say it's probably not going to happen, but let's just assume that we're not going to have any conflict between any petro states for the next 50 years. Do you see the industry obviously now classifying low carbon hydrogen to also include blue? Do you see the industry basically shifting back to blue hydrogen, assuming the cost goes low and the cost is obviously competitive, especially with that of the US price after the introduction of the IRA scheme? Do you see industry probably moving back to blue hydrogen, which kind of indirectly negates commitment goes to net zero by recommitting to large production of natural gas?
Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions in there, and it's very difficult to unpick in a short space of time. I really totally agree with Lily's point that the benchmark here should be an emissions rate related to the product, as opposed to let's go for blue or green. Really, what we care about here is the Paris climate emissions budget. So fitting within that is priority number one. Supply chain, global unrest, costs associated with green or blue hydrogen are unpredictable. And I don't think we can say for sure what will happen in the future. Let's create a level playing field, make sure technology is appropriately supported for development, and push as hard as we can on low carbon hydrogen.
And obviously, on your point on technology, a question for Jamie. So Jamie, I know you have a very, very strong background, selling hydrogen assets, be it, SMRs or probably even hydrogen electrolyzers. So you have a very, very strong expertise in that field. Hydrogen is a relatively novel technology. Do you think, based on our net zero plans, do you think that the industry is well equipped to actually meet its targets on or before 2050?
No, I think blue hydrogen is fairly mature technology. This kind of technology has been around for years. It will get slightly better, but ultimately it's not going to get that much better. I think what's interesting with green hydrogen is that we're currently at about 70% electrical efficiency for the technologies that you can find out there today. Solid oxide electrolysis is TRL 8 coming in, and that's going to that's higher efficiency, maybe 90%, maybe more if you have a heat source there. I see other technologies around that are claiming 95% efficiency in the lab. So I think that we're going to a place where the efficiency is rising as this technology matures. The value chain is rapidly maturing. I always like to say that if you go to an electrolyzer factory today, you will see that it looks like guys building Ferraris. A bunch of guys standing about with spanners in their hands, putting these things together. In the next few years, we're going to see the kind of plants where these electrolyzers come together like Fiats, with prices to match. So that's, robotic automation. The parts are going to be done in a different way, so they're simpler. So I think as the industry matures, I think it can scale really quickly. If we look at what's happened in wind, in solar, we see the same trajectory. We see the same pattern, scale coming up, cost coming down. So I'm very optimistic that hydrogen can meet the 2050 goals.
And then obviously to touch on how the solar and wind industry scaled up remarkably over the last decade. Obviously, this was, I mean, this was basically based on a lot of subsidy packages put by governments all across the world. Obviously, in the UK, the introduction of CFDs for solar initially, and then offshore wind, and that really scaled up the market. And you know, different countries all around the world, they have different subsidy packages or favorable policies to encourage the development or the investment in renewables, and that's what really drove the cost down. So obviously, with hydrogen electrolyzers, would you encourage a similar type of strategy? Obviously, Tessa mentioned the IRA, which is a great strategy for the US, because that really takes the price down. But would you encourage a more global subsidy type package or favorable planning policies for hydrogen electrolyzers to expedite the cost?
I think the Americans are doing what the Americans do, and they're great. They throw lots of money at problems, and they let economics sort it all out. And I think the Europeans are taking a more technology-led approach. So the gold standard for me is the EU Innovation Fund, and they're really targeting that money at specific innovations that they think can scale. And I believe in this round, you're going to see more money directed at plants, so plants to produce machines, and less at projects, because before it's been more project-led. But you need to do both, of course, because the projects create the market, but also you need to have manufacturing plants which are innovative, which can bring down the costs on the other side. So I think the EU Innovation Fund is, much more technology-led and something that should be copied.
Thank you so much,
And
Jamie.
to add a little bit to that point, a lot of surveys of existing and future plans for manufacturing capacity are showing that, at least in this near 5-term time period, that manufacturing ability to supply the electrolyzers is not going to be the limiting factor. We're seeing gigawatt scale manufacturing facilities come up all over the world, and analysis that we've done at RMI using BNEF's recent market outlook report shows that compared to the existing project pipeline of how many electrolyzers will be demanded, we have 2.5 times that in potential manufacturing availability based off of current plans and announced plans for manufacturing capacity. And so really the name of the game is, there still seems to be remaining this discrepancy between kind of the world of demand having a lot of uncertainty and hesitation that there is that supply that is going to be available. And from the supplier's perspective, if there's not that demand, then they will not be able to meet the throughput they need and they will go out of business. And so it really is still in that messy middle, right, of making that certainty heard throughout the value chain.
Thank you, Tessa. And while you're still here, there's actually a question from the audience, and I think this is mostly directed to you, Tessa. So what are the infrastructure requirements for the US to be the dominant global exporter? Are LNG terminals and train compatible for conversion?
Yeah, so in order for the US to be able to export hydrogen, we're going to need to scale up our port side infrastructure to be able to store and convert hydrogen to the necessary energy carriers that we're seeing that can get hydrogen across the ocean with sufficient energy density and low cost. And we're seeing ammonia emerge as one of the core energy carriers to move hydrogen around. And so in the US, there's a lot of existing ammonia production capacity that we see in the Gulf of Mexico region, so that kind of Houston, Texas area. That infrastructure to be bolstered, thinking about just getting the ability, right, to store and convert hydrogen at scale. I think broadly there is a need to retrofit existing natural gas infrastructure and pivot that to be applicable for hydrogen. I think it gets tricky when that existing infrastructure is presently being used, and we need that supply. We can't just immediately transition it if we're still reliant on any product or storage that's being used.
And Tessa, do we have a cost, maybe a cost per megawatt or a cost per megawatt hour for retrofitting hydrogen to existing gas pipelines or gas infrastructure?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
That's fine. All right, I do have another question. I'm going to leave this question open for anybody who wants to actually tackle it. So this is the problem on freshwater usage, so the limitations of scaling up hydrogen, and obviously we all know that fresh water is the feedstock used to produce green hydrogen. So can anybody touch on this problem or elaborate more on this issue?
I have some thoughts here. So I think there is a distinction that needs to be made between freshwater being a necessary feedstock for electrolysis versus highly purified water being required as a feedstock. Electrolysis requires highly pure water, but that does not mean that that water needs to come from freshwater, potable water sources. We see a lot of room for, be it seawater, municipal wastewater, industrial wastewater, even water found in food waste, to use existing wastewater treatment technologies that are seen at scale with high levels of technological maturity across other industries, to be taken and to be applied for the water needs for hydrogen, combined with the high levels of purification processes that we see typical in any sort of balance of plant of hydrogen production facilities. And so I think trying to explore different avenues to provide that initial source of water for hydrogen, or frankly, broadly, any sort of energy generation process, because water as part of the hydrogen production process for green hydrogen is not novel. We need water for blue hydrogen, for coal, for natural gas electricity generation.
Yeah,
and oftentimes in well-designed green hydrogen systems, that amount of water is far lesser than the amount of water we could see for other types of hydrogen or electricity production technologies. And what's exciting too is a lot of these solutions to, say, treat salt water and use that as a feedstock for electrolysis, they come at low cost and low additional energy requirement. So what we see is, say, roughly no more than 10 cents per kilogram could be added if you need to install a desalination plant, and no more than 1/100th of the energy requirement would also be needed additionally. And so I think it really is critical, given that a lot of areas globally are seeing increasing droughts, right, that we start to think creatively about how can we use existing sources of wastewater or non-potable sources as feedstocks.
Does anyone else want to touch on this limitations with fresh water?
Just one thing. If we look at the world we're going to, we're going to be using less fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel industry is incredibly water intensive. Yeah, and we're getting rid of that industry. So I think net on balance, and it may be different in different places, but on balance, we may end up using less water in a renewable future than we currently use in the oil and gas fueled reality that we have today.
Okay, any other input on this issue? Okay, probably just a few more questions. A question from Tom McLean said, is green hydrogen moved by a ship burdened bunker oil still green? I don't quite get the question, Tom, but I think what he's trying to say is, how is green hydrogen transported internationally? Jamie,
so largely there.
Oh, go ahead, Tessa.
So largely there is an emissions impact that oftentimes is not discussed when we talk about moving hydrogen around. I guess going back to perhaps the question of, is that green? I mean, obviously these emissions are going into the atmosphere and they need to be accounted for. And we need to be moving towards methods of moving hydrogen around that are not carbon intensive. However, a lot of, for example, the US tax credit incentives, they take a well-to-gate approach of what is that emissions threshold. And so they're not including downstream emissions associated with transport. And so how many countries are exposed to finding green hydrogen oftentimes are excluding those transportation emissions, which we could talk broadly about if that's a positive or a negative thing, but those are emissions that are going into the world, and it is contributing to a life cycle emission of green hydrogen production.
I would just say as well that, you know, I don't see that ships that are designed to ship green hydrogen will probably run on bunker fuel. And what we may see, especially for liquid, such as liquid hydrogen or ammonia, is that these ships will actually run on their own boil off. So as these ships travel, the liquid inside them vaporizes, and they can size the insulation requirements so the boil off actually matches the fuel consumption of the ship. So this may be a non issue going forward.
Okay, well, I believe this is about it. I want to thank everyone for participating. This has been very, very insightful, and also gives us a lot more information about the hydrogen industry as a whole. Thanks to all the participants for actually taking the time. I do really, really appreciate it. And hopefully we can actually have more of this in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, folks.
Yeah.
All right then.